Hey, how's it going everybody, and welcome to the next video on understanding anxiety. So today we're going to lay a little bit more groundwork before we really get started on the practical portion of things. The reason is I want us to have a really good grasp of what's going on with our anxiety. That way we kind of have a reference point for some of the practical things that we'll be doing. So in the last video we talked about the cycle of anxiety, and I hope that you were able to kind of pinpoint some things in your life or maybe identify with certain parts of it so that you can kind of see how that fits for you. Today we're going to go over a little bit something different. This is what I'm going to call what is anxiety. It's also could be called, where does anxiety come from? And this video is going to have a lot of psychological elements to it. And granted, there's 100 different theories out there as far as the different parts of your mind and your consciousness and things like that. So I'm not going to go too deep into it as far as telling you this is exactly how your brain works, because that's not really going to happen. What I will do is give you kind of a general grasp of the different parts of your mind and how we can figure out what parts of ourself this anxiety is coming from, and then from there we can start to learn how to deal with it. So up here I have 3 different circles. We're going to kind of call this your sphere of consciousness, right? This is you as a person. So the abbreviations are SC. This is your subconscious mind. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that. This is going to be the ego in the middle here, and then the C here is for your conscious mind. So the way that I have this set up is to kind of help illustrate how these different parts of your mind work together and kind of create the persona of who you are, right? So we have our subconscious mind, which of course most of us know is not very knowable, right? It's got a lot of different information about us. It's got a lot of built-in patterns that kind of define who we are as our true nature. And it's very difficult and takes a long time in order to shed light onto that part to learn more about ourselves. The ego is a little bit different in the sense that it kind of has a little bit of subconscious and a little bit of conscious in it, in the sense that we can see what's going on with the ego a lot easier. It's usually much more prevalent in our actual, conscious thoughts. So it's got a little bit of both here. And basically the way that this works is that I've heard the phrase that the ego is the mask of your subconscious, which is somewhat true. If we're going to have this sphere of subconscious, of ourselves here, the ego is going to be kind of the representation of that. I could give you a bit of analogy if it helps for some of you with any kind of technical background. We could view the subconscious as the computer, the actual hardware, the chips, the wires, all of that. And then you want to look at the ego, and then we're looking at the operating system. Oh, this is Windows 10, that kind of thing. And when we get to the consciousness, that's the actual program that we're running on a daily basis, like a word processor or whatever. So consciously, we're making decisions in our lives. Or at least we think that we're making conscious decisions in our lives. But the ego is really in between both of them and has a lot more control than many of us would like to think. And what this boils down to is that the consciousness is very much governed by the ego as much as it is your actual conscious mind. I know these words are getting kind of interchangeable here, but bear with me. We're going to work through this. So first, I'd like to take a little bit and talk about the ego itself. Historically speaking, the job of the ego is to preserve your life. That's what it's there for. It's the link between your subconscious, which has a plethora of information that you can't consciously access, and then your conscious mind. So what it's doing is bridging the gap between these two in order to supply you with information to keep you alive. So like I said, historically speaking, this was a very straightforward task, right? If you want to go way back, we get out the cave, we see a bear. The ego's like, hey, that's a bear, you need to run away from that. So it's a very easy job for it to fulfill. However, nowadays it's a little bit more convoluted than that, and there's quite a few reasons for that. What it boils down to is that we have very few literal life-threatening issues in our world. As much as the news would probably tell you otherwise, the actual risk to your life in modern society is fairly low, at least in the States. I'm sure there's different places that you can go. There's always going to be exceptions to this, of course, but just generally speaking. However, what we do have is subliminal marketing. We have the news. We have propaganda. We have all these different information outlets that are actually designed to feed into your subconscious and ego. So what happens at this point is that the ego is getting fed this information from your subconscious mind of, this is a problem, this is threatening our existence, I have to deal with this, right? So then the ego is going to try and tell the conscious mind, the logical part of us, hey, this is a problem, we have to deal with this, this is threatening us. And of course, most of the time in our modern society, the things that the ego will portray to us as dangerous, we logically say, well, that's not really a problem. I don't have to have this fancy car in order to be complete. But all the advertising that we see on TV, goes to our conscious mind, is filtered through the ego and says, no, you have to have that car. Now, of course, that's a very generic example, but you can kind of see the process and how this may work out. The issue with anxiety is that this is boiling down to is that after a while, the ego is trying to tell you something, right? It's saying, hey, watch out for this danger, watch out for this threat. And the logical mind is like, that's ridiculous, go away. And so we've kind of like put this line here. We've kind of cut off communication with our ego. Now, that's not actually possible in the sense that the ego is always going to be able to say things to you and have a part of your conscious mind. So we've actually just kind of shut it off. We're not listening to it anymore. We're ignoring it. We're suppressing it. If you go back to the cycle, that'll show you there. And after a while, the pressure starts to build up, and the ego is getting more and more desperate to try and tell us that something is a problem, because that's constantly getting fed in to our subconscious through our patterns. Reference back to the cycle of anxiety. You can see how these things are going in. So we have our information that comes in here. You'll have to excuse my handwriting. So we've got info going into the subconscious through various means, right? And this happens all on its own. There's not really a whole lot you can do about it except control what you're exposed to. That's increasingly difficult nowadays. Then the ego is kind of getting that information from the subconscious, processing it and kind of giving us threats to be aware of. And then the conscious mind, of course, sees those threats as like, that's not going to happen, that's stupid, why would I believe that? But the problem is that these two parts, the larger and more powerful parts of yourself, believe that those things are true. So this is kind of like where the core concept of anxiety comes into place, where the conscious mind is ignoring what the ego and the subconscious are feeding to it. So we're creating this rift. And if we go back to our cycle, that's building up pressure, right? A good analogy would be, a child. If a kid has something they want to tell you, they're going to keep pestering you until you pay attention to them, right? They're going to, hey mom, hey mom, hey mom. They're going to do that, and it's annoying to you in some ways. So you ignore it, or maybe eventually you give in, whatever the case may be. My point is that eventually the child is going to start to throw a fit, right? He's going to get very upset. You're not listening to him. You're not paying attention to him. You're not giving him what he needs in order to feel like he's contributing. And so that's, in a concept, in a nutshell, what anxiety is. It's the ego trying to present to you something that you've been ignoring for a long time. And it doesn't matter how reasonable it may seem to the conscious mind or not. What matters is that the ego believes it to be true and is therefore presenting it to you and has not been heard. And in essence, that's what the anxiety is. It wants to be heard. So the reason I'm kind of breaking this down for you is so that you can kind of see how the ego is actually trying to do its job, right? It's trying to keep you alive. It's trying to keep you healthy. And through no fault of its own, it hasn't been heard. And now it's starting to throw a fit, right? So if we kind of go on to the repressed experiences portion of this, when we have a negative experience in our life and we repress that experience, we don't deal with that experience, then it still happens to our subconscious mind. That subconscious mind does process it and does deal with it. The problem with that is that the subconscious mind doesn't have the conscious logic to it. So it's taking things at face value, right? And that eventually feeds back into your ego, which is trying to tell you that something's a problem. And that's kind of how we get this cycle. The other big thing that I want you to take from this is that all of this is a part of you. Your anxiety is a part of you. Your ego is a part of you. I know there's a lot of spiritual teachers or life coaches, or there's a lot of new age information out there as well, how the ego can be very detrimental and you have to learn to control it, and that can almost put you in a very combative state with it. And we know from reference that the combativeness towards the ego only makes it worse. You know, the more that we try to push back and push away against the ego, the louder it gets. Because we have to recognize that the ego and the subconscious are very large parts of ourself, and they are very powerful parts of ourself. And we have to try and remove this line so that we've got clear communication again, and we can start to merge this to get it to be a whole person again. There's another aspect of anxiety that I'd like to take a minute to talk about, and that's the actual physical aspect of it. So one of the main differences between a panic attack and just regular excitement is your breath, right? When you're usually having a panic attack or you're feeling very anxious, you kind of like shallow breathing, you're not breathing very well, and so that kind of accelerates that. But in essence, what's happening during a panic attack is you're experiencing a flight or fight response. Because the ego has presented something to you and you're ignoring it, so it's, you know, the ego and subconscious has more control of your body than your conscious mind does. So that's actually sending these signals to your body, that's flight or fight response. We're in danger, we have to do something. It doesn't matter if it's, you know, there's not actually a bear outside the cave. It could be whatever that trigger is for you. Whatever it is that this part of yourself believes to be a legitimate threat. And so once we experience that flight or fight response, we actually can start to become addicted to that. In the same sense that you have thrill seekers out there who, you know, go and jump off of cliffs or go scuba diving way too deep or things like that, you know, pushing the boundaries. They're the adrenaline junkie per se. In essence, that's the same exact sensation that you're experiencing with anxiety. The only difference is that people who are adrenaline junkies like it and want to go for it, whereas with the panic attacks, we typically are pushing away from it. So we actually have chemically in our cells, our bodies get addicted to this. And what happens is that the biochemical aspect of the mind, of the brain, and of your individual cells are starting to get a craving for this adrenaline rush. And so that feeds right back into your subconscious that says, oh, the body wants an adrenaline rush. It wants to be faced with this, you know, life-threatening issue. Well, pass it off, ego. And so that the ego says, oh, yeah, well, this is a life-threatening issue. And then we are triggered back into a panic attack. So you can see how the cycle of anxiety, as well as, you know, the sources of it, kind of all merge together in the sense where it makes it very easy for us to be kind of trapped into this cycle, and how if we're not paying attention to what's going on, it's kind of a self-feeding loop. And I've noticed that myself personally, and probably many of you as well, during an actual panic attack, that many of the experiences that you have in a panic attack are self-feeding, in the sense of once you're triggered and you start to experience that small blip of adrenaline, that can usually trigger some more, right? And so it kind of feeds on itself and builds up its own momentum. And on the micro aspect of just the panic attack, that same principle applies to the entirety of anxiety itself, where it's a very self-feeding loop, especially if we're not changing our patterns, if we're not changing what info we're having coming in, if we're not changing our actions. This can definitely get to the point where it's going to continually get worse and worse, which is definitely why I want to make this series and help you guys out, because it's very difficult especially once it gets to a certain point, to make progress and kind of get back out of that. So I hope that you can kind of get a grasp of what I'm talking about here. I know that these are kind of more philosophical or abstract ideas. I would recommend definitely, you know, if you need to rewatch the cycle of anxiety video to see if you can kind of correlate it to the things I've said here today. Of course, always feel free, you know, put some comments in the video to let me know if there's any specific topics or processes that you had a hard time understanding or would like me to go back over. I would be happy to. Of course, you can always send me a private message. But with this and the previous video, I feel like we've really laid some groundwork as far as the fundamental principles of anxiety and kind of understanding what's going on, so that way we can actually take action. Now we can know what to do and what part of our anxiety. Alright guys, well I hope this helps. Like I said, let me know if you need anything from me, and I'll see you next time.